Riverside's most exclusive coffee shop hummed with the polished conversations of Connecticut's elite, crystal chandeliers casting warm amber light across marble tables. Charlotte Sterling's manicured fingers froze above her MacBook as venom-laced laughter shattered the sophisticated atmosphere. A janitor? Seriously. The young woman's voice dripped with disdain, designed to humiliate. The man across from her, weathered hands, salt and pepper hair, work-worn jacket absorbed each cruel word with quiet dignity that made Charlotte's chest tighten. Then he did something that stopped her breathing. He smiled, thanked his tormentor, and walked away with his head held high. Charlotte's chair scraped against marble as she stood, her voice cutting through the stunned silence with words so unexpected, so fierce with emotion, that conversations died mid-sentence. What she said next would leave the entire coffee shop in tears and change how everyone saw the man they'd just witnessed being torn apart. James Walsh had never imagined himself sitting in Meridian Coffee House at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, adjusting the collar of his only good shirt for the third time. The overhead lights seemed too bright, casting harsh shadows across tables where people half his age sipped $20 lattes and discussed stock portfolios. His hands, scrubbed raw but still bearing the permanent stains of industrial cleaning chemicals, trembled slightly as he checked his watch. She was 10 minutes late, but he'd wait. His colleagues at the office building had insisted this woman was perfect for him, though their grins had held something he couldn't quite decipher. The setup had come out of nowhere 3 days ago, when Derek from the 3rd floor approached him during his evening rounds. "Jimmy, you've been alone too long, man. I know this girl, beautiful, smart, works in marketing. She specifically asked about meeting someone genuine, someone real." The enthusiasm in Derek's voice had been infectious, and for the first time in months, James had allowed himself to hope. Cole had been thrilled when he'd mentioned the date, his 16-year-old son practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad, you deserve to be happy. Mom would want you to try again." Those words had echoed in James's mind as he'd ironed his shirt this morning, practiced conversation starters in the mirror, and spent his last $40 on a decent haircut. Now, surrounded by Connecticut's social elite in their designer clothes and confident laughter, James felt the familiar weight of not belonging. His reflection in the shop's mirror showed a man who looked exactly like what he was, a 44-year-old janitor who worked nights to support his son and study law on weekends. The admission stung, but he'd learned long ago that honesty was the only foundation worth building on. His late wife Sarah had taught him that, among so many other things. She'd never cared that he'd left the police force to care for her during her cancer battle, never minded when he'd taken the janitorial job because it offered health insurance and flexible hours. Sarah had seen worth where others saw failure. Charlotte Sterling hadn't planned to witness a crucifixion that evening. She'd chosen Meridian specifically for its quiet corner tables and reliable Wi-Fi, needing to review contracts away from her office's constant interruptions. As founding partner of Sterling and Associates, she'd built her reputation on meticulous preparation and unwavering focus. But tonight, her attention kept drifting to the man at the nearby table, something about his careful posture, the way he'd ordered just coffee while others indulged in elaborate drinks, spoke to a humility she rarely encountered in her world. She'd noticed him before, actually, during her late nights at the office. He was the janitor who cleaned with methodical precision, who always nodded respectfully when their paths crossed, who somehow managed to be invisible and utterly present at the same time. The young woman who swept into the coffee shop 20 minutes late transformed the atmosphere like a cold front. Her heels clicked against marble with military precision, designer bag swinging from her shoulder as she scanned the room with barely concealed disdain. She was beautiful in the calculated way of someone who'd weaponized her appearance, every feature designed to command attention and submission. When her gaze landed on James, her expression shifted through a progression Charlotte recognized from 1,000 corporate negotiations, assessment, dismissal, and finally, cruel amusement. The woman's approach to James's table carried the predatory grace of someone who'd found their entertainment for the evening. "You must be James," she said, sliding into the chair across from him without removing her coat. Her voice carried the particular brand of condescension Charlotte had learned to despise in her profession, syrupy sweet on the surface, razor sharp underneath. "I'm Ashley. Derek told me so much about you." The way she emphasized so much made it clear that whatever Derek had shared, it hadn't prepared her for the reality of James Walsh. Her eyes catalogued him like a prosecutor building a case. The discount store shirt, the nervous fidgeting, the calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. Charlotte felt her own hands tighten around her coffee cup as she watched Ashley's smile sharpen into something predatory. James rose slightly when Ashley sat down, an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to amuse her. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice carrying traces of a Boston accent softened by years in Connecticut. "Can I get you something to drink? They have an excellent selection here." His genuine attempt at hospitality only seemed to fuel Ashley's amusement. She glanced around the coffee shop as if seeing it for the first time, her gaze lingering on the other patrons with their laptops and business discussions. When she looked back at James, her expression had hardened into something that made Charlotte's stomach clench with anticipation of cruelty. "A janitor," Ashley said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to neighboring tables. "Derek said you had an interesting job, but he didn't mention you were a janitor." The word dripped from her lips like something distasteful, designed to wound and humiliate. "That's really something. Do you enjoy cleaning up after other people all day?" Her tone suggested she already knew the answer, already judged him for it. James's face didn't change, but Charlotte saw his shoulders tense slightly, the only sign that the verbal arrow had found its mark. Around them, other conversations began to quiet, as people sensed drama unfolding at the corner table. "I do, actually," James replied after a moment, his voice steady despite the public nature of the attack. "There's something satisfying about leaving a place better than you found it. Making sure people have a clean, safe environment to work in." His answer was honest, without defensiveness or apology, which only seemed to irritate Ashley further. She'd clearly expected shame, maybe anger, certainly not this quiet dignity that refused to bend under her assault. Charlotte found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into this strange drama playing out mere feet away. She'd witnessed countless corporate takedowns, but this felt different, more personal, more vicious. Ashley's laugh was like breaking glass. "How noble of you. And that shirt, is that your best one?" She gestured at James's carefully pressed, but obviously inexpensive button-down. "It's very practical." The word practical carried enough venom to kill, delivered with the surgical precision of someone who'd perfected the art of social assassination. "I have to ask, are you seriously 44? Because honestly, I was expecting someone a bit more established. You know, successful." Each word was chosen for maximum damage, delivered in front of an audience that was now openly staring at their table. James set down his coffee cup with steady hands, though Charlotte noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. "I am 44, he said quietly, "and I'm exactly as successful as I need to be. I provide for my son, I'm working toward my law degree, and I sleep well at night knowing I've earned everything I have honestly." His response carried no anger, no attempt to match Ashley's cruelty with his own. Instead, it held something Charlotte recognized from her toughest negotiations, the unshakable foundation of someone who knew their own worth. But Ashley wasn't finished, and Charlotte could see the killing blow coming like a storm front on the horizon. "A son," Ashley repeated, as if the concept was foreign to her. "So you're divorced? Or are we talking about a more complicated situation? Because honestly, single dad baggage is a lot to take on. I mean, who has time for someone else's kid?" The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking in its casual delivery, each word designed to strip away James's dignity in front of an audience that had now abandoned all pretense of not listening. Charlotte felt her own breathing become shallow as she watched James's face. Still calm, still composed, but with something breaking behind his eyes that spoke to losses Ashley couldn't begin to understand. "My wife passed away 3 years ago," James said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a grief that had been processed but never fully healed. "Cancer. Cole is 16 now, and he's the best thing that ever happened to me." The simplicity of his statement, the complete absence of self-pity or blame, seemed to stun Ashley into momentary silence. But only momentary. Charlotte could see her recalibrating, searching for a new angle of attack, unwilling to let her victim escape with dignity intact. Around them, the coffee shop had fallen into an uncomfortable hush, other patrons shifting in their seats as they witnessed something that felt increasingly like public torture. What happened next would replay in Charlotte's mind for weeks afterward. James reached into his wallet-worn leather that had seen better years and pulled out a $20 bill. He placed it carefully on the table between them, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Thank you for being honest about your feelings," he said, his voice carrying no sarcasm, no bitterness, only a grace that seemed impossible under the circumstances. "I appreciate you not wasting either of our time with false pleasantries. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." He stood slowly, nodded once to Ashley with genuine politeness, and turned towards the door. Charlotte's chair scraped against marble as she shot to her feet, her laptop nearly sliding off the table in her haste. The sound cut through the coffee shop's stunned silence like a gunshot, drawing every eye in the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she faced a room full of Connecticut's social elite, people who knew her reputation, her net worth, her carefully cultivated image. But watching James Walsh walk away, after absorbing that level of cruelty with such dignity, had torn something open inside her chest. When she spoke, her voice carried across the suddenly silent coffee shop with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. "Excuse me," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Ashley looked up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted before she could savor her victory. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I have something to say." The room held its breath as Charlotte took a step closer to Ashley's table, her professional composure warring with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel righteous fury. "That man you just humiliated with such obvious pleasure? He cleans the building where I work. Every night for the past 2 years, I've watched him treat every person he encounters with respect and dignity. Security guards, executives, cleaning staff, it doesn't matter to him. He sees people, not positions." Ashley's face had shifted from annoyed surprise to something approaching alarm as she realized she was being publicly called out by someone whose designer suit and confident bearing marked her as serious opposition. "I don't think this is any of your business," she started, but Charlotte held up a hand that brooked no interruption. Around them, phones appeared as other patrons began recording what was clearly becoming a memorable confrontation. Charlotte felt the weight of their attention but pressed forward, driven by something deeper than social justice. A recognition of character that she'd almost let walk out the door unmarked and undefended. "You're right, it's not my business," Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I'm making it my business because what I just witnessed was the kind of cruelty that reveals everything about your character and nothing about his. You judge that man based on his job, his clothes, his circumstances, surface things that have nothing to do with his worth as a human being. And do you know what he did in response to your calculated cruelty? He thanked you. He paid for your time. He wished you well." Her voice began to crack with emotion, surprising her with its intensity. "That's not weakness. That's strength. That's character. That's the kind of person who makes the world better just by being in it." Tears had begun flowing down Charlotte's cheeks, though she seemed unaware of them. Around the coffee shop, she could see similar reactions: a businessman dabbing at his eyes with a napkin, a young mother covering her mouth as her own tears started, an elderly couple holding hands and nodding in recognition of truth being spoken. "You want to know about success?" Charlotte's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the room. "Success isn't about your job title, or your salary, or your designer handbag. Success is about how you treat people when you have power over them. It's about dignity in the face of humiliation. It's about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, and by that measure, the man who just walked out of here is more successful than anyone in this room." Ashley had gone pale, her earlier confidence evaporating under the weight of Charlotte's words and the palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. Other patrons were openly staring now, some with tears in their eyes, others nodding in agreement with Charlotte's passionate defense. The young woman who had seemed so powerful moments ago now appeared small and ashamed, her cruelty exposed under the bright lights of public scrutiny. It was just—" she stammered. But Charlotte wasn't finished, her voice growing even more powerful as she reached her crescendo. "You didn't just insult a janitor," Charlotte said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her position and the complete conviction of her beliefs. "You insulted a father who lost his wife and kept going for his son. You insulted a man who works night shifts so he can study law during the day. You insulted someone who treats everyone with respect regardless of their status. And most importantly, you insulted the kind of human being this world desperately needs more of." She paused, letting her words settle over the silent room like a benediction. "I've been CEO of my company for 8 years. I've made millions of dollars. I have degrees from Harvard and Columbia, and I would be honored to know that man's name and call him my friend." The silence that followed Charlotte's words was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of people crying throughout the coffee shop. Ashley sat frozen in her chair, her earlier cruelty now seeming not just wrong but actively evil in the face of Charlotte's passionate defense. Other patrons began to stir, some standing as if in respect for what they'd just witnessed, others reaching for their phones to call friends and family about the extraordinary scene they'd just observed. Charlotte stood breathing heavily, surprised by the intensity of her own emotion, aware that she'd just revealed more of herself in 5 minutes than she typically did in 5 years. James had stopped at the coffee shop's entrance when he heard Charlotte's voice rise behind him. He turned slowly, his face a mixture of surprise and something deeper, a recognition of being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in years. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Charlotte saw in his expression not just gratitude, but a kind of wonder that someone had chosen to stand up for him when he hadn't been able to stand up for himself. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and understanding, before James nodded once, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, and stepped out into the Connecticut evening. Charlotte remained standing for several moments after James left, the weight of what she'd done settling over her like a warm blanket. Around her, the coffee shop slowly came back to life, but with a different energy, conversations more subdued, interactions more gentle, as if her words had reminded everyone present of something important they'd forgotten. Ashley gathered her things in silence and left without another word, her earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been shame. Several patrons approached Charlotte as she packed up her laptop, thanking her for her courage, sharing their own stories of kindness overlooked and character misjudged. But as Charlotte drove home through Riverside's tree-lined streets that night, her mind wasn't on the accolades or the viral video she was sure someone had posted. Instead, she found herself thinking about James Walsh, really thinking about him for the first time. She'd seen him dozens of times over the past 2 years, but always as background, always as the janitor. Now she wondered about his story, his dreams, the son he'd mentioned with such obvious pride, the man who'd absorbed that level of public humiliation with such grace couldn't be just anyone. There had to be more to James Walsh than met the eye, and Charlotte Sterling, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, was determined to find out what that was. The next evening, Charlotte found herself staying late at the office for no particular reason, reviewing contracts that could have waited until morning. When she heard the familiar sound of the cleaning cart in the hallway, her heart began to beat faster. James appeared in her doorway at exactly 9:15, just as he had for the past 2 years. But tonight everything was different. He knocked softly on her open door, waiting for permission to enter with the same respect he'd always shown, but there was something new in his eyes, a wariness mixed with curiosity about the woman who'd defended him so passionately the night before. "Good evening, Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity she'd witnessed at the coffee shop. "I wanted to thank you for what you did last night." "You didn't have to do that." His words were simple, but Charlotte could hear layers of meaning beneath them, gratitude, surprise, and perhaps a question about her motives. She set down her pen and really looked at him, seeing not the janitor but the man who'd faced down public humiliation with more grace than most people could muster in their best moments. Standing there in her office doorway in his work uniform, James Walsh possessed something that all her Harvard education and corporate success couldn't buy: unshakable integrity. "I did have to do that," Charlotte replied, surprising herself with the intensity of her conviction. "What happened to you was wrong, and sometimes wrong things need to be called out." She paused, studying his face in the soft light of her desk lamp. "Can I ask you something? How did you do it? How did you stay so calm when she was trying to tear you apart?" The question had been haunting her since the previous evening. In her world of corporate warfare, she'd seen powerful men crumble under far less vicious attacks. But James had stood firm, unbroken, almost serene in the face of calculated cruelty. James was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the thoughtfulness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "My wife used to say that other people's words only have the power we give them." he finally said. Sarah was everything good in the world. When she was dying, she made me promise that I wouldn't let anger or bitterness take root in my heart. She said Cole would need a father who could show him how to be strong without being cruel, how to be confident without being arrogant. His voice carried the weight of a promise kept, a legacy honored. I think about that every day. About the man she wanted me to be, the father Cole deserves to have. Something shifted in Charlotte's chest as she listened to James speak about his late wife and his son. In her world of mergers and acquisitions, of calculated moves and strategic advantages, she'd forgotten that some people were motivated by love rather than ambition, by legacy rather than profit. She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman, Charlotte said softly. And from what I saw last night, she'd be proud of the man you've become. The words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she was trying to express, but James's slight smile suggested he understood her meaning. She would have liked you, James said, and the simplicity of the statement hit Charlotte harder than any compliment she'd received in her professional life. Sarah always said that real strength shows itself when people don't have to prove anything to anyone. What you did last night, that took courage and kindness. She would have appreciated both. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. If you don't mind me asking, why did you do it? You could have just ignored the whole situation. Most people would have. Charlotte found herself searching for an answer that made sense, not just to James, but to herself. Because, she said slowly, in 8 years of running this company, I've met a lot of people who think success gives them the right to diminish others, and watching you handle that situation with such grace, it reminded me that there are still people in the world who understand that character matters more than career, that how you treat others says everything about who you are. She gestured around her expensive office with its awards and accolades. All of this means nothing if we use it to make other people feel small. As the weeks passed, Charlotte found herself looking forward to James's evening rounds with an anticipation that surprised her. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, as the formal barrier between CEO and janitor dissolved into something approaching friendship. She learned that he'd been a police officer before Sarah's diagnosis, that he'd left the force to care for her during her final months. She discovered that he was indeed studying law, taking online courses after Cole went to bed, determined to build a better future for his son. Most surprisingly, she found that James was brilliant, not just street smart, but genuinely intelligent, with insights into human nature that her Harvard professors had never taught her. You know, Charlotte said one evening as James finished cleaning her office, you should consider applying to law school full-time. With your background in law enforcement and your natural understanding of people, you'd make an excellent attorney. She'd been thinking about this for days, watching him study during his breaks, seeing the careful notes he made in the margins of his textbooks. I have connections at several law schools. I could make some calls. The offer was genuine, born from respect rather than pity. But she saw James stiffened slightly at her words. I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Sterling, but I can't accept that kind of help. James said carefully, I need to earn this on my own, for Cole and for myself. Sarah always said that anything worth having was worth working for. His refusal was gentle but firm, and Charlotte felt a flush of embarrassment at having overstepped. But she also felt a surge of respect for his integrity, his unwillingness to take shortcuts even when they were offered by someone who genuinely wanted to help. In her world, people fought for advantages like the one she'd just offered. James's refusal reminded her why she'd been drawn to defend him in the first place. "I understand," Charlotte said, and she genuinely did. "But promise me this. If you ever need a character reference or someone to vouch for your work ethic, you'll let me help with that. That's not charity, that's just honesty." James nodded, accepting this smaller offer with the same dignity he brought to everything else. As he left her office that night, Charlotte found herself wondering about the conversation she'd overheard between some of her building's other tenants. There had been something about unusual activity in the Hayes and Partners suite, something that had made James's expression grow thoughtful and concerned. It was during one of their evening conversations that Charlotte first noticed James's unusual interest in the Hayes and Partners law firm that occupied the floor below hers. She'd mentioned a partnership proposal from Harold Hayes, and James's reaction had been immediate and concerning, a tightening around his eyes, a careful neutrality that replaced his usual openness. "Is there something I should know about Hayes and Partners?" she asked directly, recognizing the expression from her own experience with corporate investigations. "You look like a cop who's spotted something suspicious." James hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "I probably shouldn't say anything," he began, then stopped. "But you've been kind to me, and I'd hate to see you get hurt by association." He set down his cleaning supplies and faced her directly. "I've noticed some things during my rounds. Late-night meetings when the building should be empty. Documents being shredded in quantities that seem excessive for normal business. Phone conversations that stop abruptly when someone realizes I'm nearby." His voice carried the professional assessment of someone trained to notice patterns, to spot irregularities that others might miss. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine as James spoke. Hayes and Partners had been aggressively courting her business for months, offering partnerships that seemed too good to be true. Now, listening to James's careful observations, she wondered if they actually were. "What kind of documents?" she asked, her legal mind immediately shifting into investigative mode. "Did you see anything specific?" She trusted James's instincts completely. His police background and natural integrity made him a more reliable witness than most people she knew in the legal profession. "Financial records mostly," James replied, "but also correspondence that looked official government letterhead, court documents, that kind of thing. And the shredding always happens right after Harold Hayes has those late-night meetings with people I don't recognize." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Mrs. Sterling, I've seen this pattern before, back when I was on the force. It usually means someone's trying to hide evidence of wrongdoing. I can't prove anything, but my gut says you should be very careful about any business dealings with that firm." The investigation that followed consumed Charlotte's thoughts for weeks. Working with a private investigator she trusted, she began looking into Hayes and Partners' business practices, their client list, their financial history. What she found was a web of corruption so sophisticated and far-reaching that it took her breath away. Money laundering, client fund misappropriation, evidence tampering. Harold Hayes had built his firm's success on a foundation of criminal activity that had somehow escaped detection for years. The only reason it was coming to light now was because James Walsh, in his quiet, observant way, had noticed what others had missed. But the most shocking discovery came when Charlotte realized how close she'd come to being victimized herself. The partnership proposal from Hayes and Partners hadn't been a business opportunity. It had been a sophisticated attempt to gain access to her client accounts and financial records. If she'd signed the agreements Hayes had been pushing, her firm would have become unwittingly complicit in money laundering operations that spanned multiple states. James's careful observations and willingness to speak up had quite literally saved her company and her reputation. "You realize you probably saved my entire career," Charlotte told James one evening as they reviewed the evidence she'd gathered. "If I'd signed that partnership agreement, I would have been legally liable for their criminal activities. My firm, my clients, everything I've built, it all would have been destroyed." The magnitude of what James had done for her was staggering. This man, whom others saw as just a janitor, had been her guardian angel without her even knowing it. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." James shook his head, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone should do when they see something wrong." But Charlotte could see deeper meaning in his words, a connection to their first meeting at the coffee shop. James had once again chosen to do the right thing, even when it would have been easier to stay silent, even when speaking up might have put his own job at risk. His character was consistent, unshakable, rooted in principles that didn't bend based on circumstances or personal advantage. The arrest of Harold Hayes and the dismantling of his criminal operation made headlines throughout Connecticut's legal community. Charlotte found herself fielding calls from reporters, from other law firms who'd been approached by Hayes, from clients concerned about their own exposure. Through it all, she was careful to protect James's identity, describing her source only as a vigilant member of the building's security team. She knew that James's role in exposing the corruption would make him a target, and she was determined to shield him from any potential retaliation. But the story didn't end with Hayes's arrest. As Charlotte worked with federal investigators to unravel the full scope of the criminal enterprise, she made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about James Walsh. Hidden in Hayes's financial records was evidence of a systematic campaign of intimidation and threats against anyone who might expose their operations. The list of targets included Charlotte herself, and the records showed that for months she'd been under surveillance, her daily routines monitored, her vulnerabilities assessed. What the records also showed was that someone had been protecting her. Her car had been checked for tracking devices. Her office had been swept for listening equipment. Potential threats had been neutralized before she'd even known they existed. The identity of her protector wasn't explicitly stated in Hayes's paranoid notes, but the timing of the protective measures, the professional competence of the countermeasures, and the careful documentation of her safety all pointed to one person. James Walsh had been silently safeguarding her for months. "You knew," Charlotte said when she confronted James with the evidence. "You knew I was in danger, and you've been protecting me all this time." The realization was overwhelming, not just the practical implications of what he'd done, but the emotional weight of being cared for so completely by someone who owed her nothing. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me about the surveillance?" She was simultaneously grateful and frustrated, moved by his protection, but angry that he'd shouldered such a burden alone. James met her gaze steadily, his expression carrying the same quiet strength she'd come to associate with him. "Because you had enough to worry about running your company. Because telling you would have made you scared and paranoid, and that's no way to live." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And because protecting people is what I do. It's who I am. I couldn't stand by and watch someone hurt you when I had the skills to prevent it." His explanation was simple, matter-of-fact, as if risking his own safety to protect hers was the most natural thing in the world. The depth of James's sacrifice hit Charlotte like a physical blow. While she'd been building her career, Accumulating wealth and accolades, he'd been working 2 jobs, his official position as a janitor and his unofficial role as her guardian. He'd used his police training and natural vigilance to keep her safe from threats she'd never even known existed. And he'd done it all without recognition, without compensation, without even her knowledge. It was protection in its purest form, selfless, competent, and invisible. Standing in her office that night, surrounded by the evidence of James's quiet heroism, Charlotte felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of value and worth. For years, she'd measured success by traditional metrics: income, prestige, professional achievement. But looking at James Walsh, seeing the complete picture of who he was and what he'd done, she realized that she'd been using the wrong measurement tools. True success, real worth, wasn't about what you accumulated for yourself, but about what you gave to others, what you protected, what you preserved. "I need to tell you something," Charlotte said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I need you to listen carefully because I've never meant anything more in my life." James nodded, giving her his complete attention in the way that had become familiar and precious to her. "You are the most successful person I've ever met, not because of your job or your bank account or your degrees, but because of who you are. Because of how you move through the world, making it better for everyone around you. Because you protect people who don't even know they need protecting. Because you choose kindness and courage even when no one's watching." Tears were flowing freely down Charlotte's cheeks now, but she didn't stop to wipe them away. "That woman at the coffee shop saw a janitor and decided you were beneath her. She couldn't see past the surface to recognize that she was in the presence of a real hero, someone who serves others not because he has to, but because that's what good people do. Someone who sacrifices his own comfort and safety for strangers who might never even know his name." Her voice broke slightly as she continued. "I've spent 8 years building a company, accumulating wealth, winning cases. And in 8 weeks of knowing you, really knowing you, you've taught me more about success and character than I learned in my entire life before." James stood quietly, absorbing her words with the same grace he brought to everything else. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "You're giving me too much credit, Mrs. Sterling. I'm just a man trying to do right by his son and honor his wife's memory. Nothing heroic about that." But Charlotte could see in his eyes that her words had touched something deep inside him, had perhaps given him a perspective on his own worth that he'd never allowed himself to consider. "That's exactly what makes you heroic," Charlotte replied. "Heroes don't see themselves as heroes. They just see what needs to be done and do it." She moved closer to him, wanting him to understand the full impact of what he'd meant to her. "You saved my company, my reputation, possibly my life. You did it without being asked, without being paid, without even being thanked until tonight. And when I try to express my gratitude, you tell me it was nothing special." She shook her head in amazement. James Walsh, if that's not heroism, then the word has no meaning. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, 2 people from completely different worlds discovering that they shared the same values, the same commitment to integrity, the same belief that character mattered more than circumstances. Charlotte told James about her childhood, about building her firm from nothing, about the loneliness that came with success in a world that often confused wealth with worth. James shared stories about his life with Sarah, about raising Cole alone, about the daily choice to remain hopeful in the face of loss and struggle. As the sun rose over Riverside that morning, Charlotte made a decision that would change both their lives. "I want to make you an offer," she said. and I want you to consider it carefully before you refuse." James raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting another attempt to fast-track his education or career. "I want to offer you a partnership in my firm. Not charity, not a favor, but a genuine partnership based on your skills, your character, and your value as a human being." James started to protest, but Charlotte held up her hand. "Let me finish. You've been protecting my interest for months without compensation. You've shown investigative skills that rival any private detective I've worked with. You have a natural understanding of people that can't be taught in law school. And most importantly, you have integrity that's absolutely unshakable." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I need someone I can trust completely. Someone who will always tell me the truth even when it's difficult to hear. I need a partner who shares my values, who understands that our job is to serve justice, not just win cases." The partnership offer wasn't just professional. It was personal recognition of everything James had come to mean to her. "I'm not offering you this because I feel sorry for you or because I want to rescue you. I'm offering it because you're exactly the kind of person I want by my side as I build something meaningful, because you've already proven that you're willing to sacrifice for others, that you see the big picture, that you understand what really matters." Charlotte's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by conviction and hope. "You talk about earning things on your own, about setting an example for Cole. What better example could you set than showing him that character and hard work are eventually recognized and rewarded?" James was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the sunrise, painting Riverside's skyline in shades of gold and pink. When he finally spoke, his voice carried wonder and something that might have been tears. "Sarah used to say that sometimes the universe puts people in our path exactly when we need them most. I thought she meant Cole when she said that he was what I needed to give my life meaning after she was gone." He turned to look at Charlotte, and she saw in his eyes a recognition that matched her own. "But maybe she meant you, too. Maybe she meant this moment, this opportunity to build something good with someone who understands what we're trying to accomplish." "So you'll consider it?" Charlotte asked, hardly daring to hope. The partnership she was offering represented everything she'd learned about value and worth, about character and success. It was her way of saying that she saw James Walsh not as the world had labeled him, but as he truly was, a man of extraordinary integrity and quiet strength, someone whose worth couldn't be measured by conventional standards, but whose character made him invaluable in ways that mattered. James smiled then, the first truly unguarded smile Charlotte had ever seen from him. "I'll consider it," he said, "but I have one condition." Charlotte nodded, ready to agree to almost anything. "Cole has to meet you first. If he doesn't approve, the deal's off." The condition was so perfectly James, putting his son's judgment ahead of his own advancement, trusting a 16-year-old's instincts about character and fit. It was another reminder of why she wanted him as a partner, why she'd come to respect him so completely. 6 months later, Charlotte stood at the podium of Riverside's community center, looking out at a crowd that included everyone from corporate executives to cleaning staff, from police officers to teachers. She'd been asked to speak about community service, about recognizing unsung heroes, about the difference between success and significance. But as she began to speak, her mind went to that evening at Meridian Coffee House, to the moment when she'd witnessed true grace under fire and decided to speak up for it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charlotte began, "I want to tell you about a man named James Walsh. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what success looked like. I thought it was about degrees and bank accounts and corner offices. Then I met James, and he taught me that real success is about character. It's about how you treat people who can't help you advance your career. It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching. It's about protecting others even when it puts you at risk. The audience listened intently as Charlotte told the story. The blind date that was meant as a cruel joke, the public humiliation that revealed character rather than destroying it, the investigation that had saved her company, the protection that had kept her safe. She spoke about partnership and respect, about recognizing worth in unexpected places, about the difference between being important and being valuable. And as she spoke, she could see James in the audience, sitting with Cole, both of them trying to look invisible while she publicly celebrated everything they meant to her and to their community. James Walsh teaches us that heroism isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. Charlotte concluded, her voice carrying across the silent room. It's about showing up every day with integrity intact. It's about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. It's about seeing the value in every person you meet, regardless of their job title or bank balance. She paused, looking directly at James, who was wiping tears from his eyes. And it's about having the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it would be safer to stay silent. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Charlotte barely heard it. Her attention was focused on James and Cole, on the pride in the young man's eyes as he looked at his father, on the quiet dignity with which James accepted recognition he'd never sought, but absolutely deserved. This was success. Charlotte realized, not the applause or the awards, but the knowledge that she'd played a small part in ensuring that character was recognized, that goodness was celebrated, that heroes were no longer invisible. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached James to shake his hand, to thank him for his service to the community, to tell him their own stories of small kindnesses that had made big differences. Charlotte watched from a distance, remembering the man who'd walked out of a coffee shop 6 months ago with his dignity intact despite public humiliation. That man had been worthy of respect and recognition then, but he'd been invisible to everyone except her. Now, finally, the world could see what she'd seen that night, that James Walsh was exactly the kind of person who made communities stronger, who made the world better, who proved that character mattered more than any external measure of success. Later that evening, as they walked to their cars in the community center parking lot, Cole looked up at his father with obvious pride. "Dad, that was amazing. Ms. Sterling was right about everything she said." James smiled at his son, the same quiet smile Charlotte had come to treasure. "She sees the best in people, Cole. That's what makes her special." But Charlotte, walking beside them, knew the truth was exactly the opposite. James Walsh had taught her to see clearly, to recognize character over credentials, to understand that the most important people in any community were often the ones working quietly behind the scenes, making everything better for everyone else. The story of James Walsh and Charlotte Sterling became something of a legend in Riverside. A reminder that worth couldn't be measured by job titles or bank accounts, that character revealed itself in moments of crisis, that sometimes the most powerful words were spoken in defense of those who couldn't defend themselves. But for Charlotte, the real story wasn't about public recognition or community service awards. It was about finding a partner who shared her values, a friend who taught her the difference between success and significance, and a man whose quiet heroism had changed not just her business, but her understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. And every evening, When James finished his rounds at Sterling and Associates now as a full partner rather than a janitor, Charlotte remembered that night at Meridian Coffee House when she'd seen Grace under fire and chosen to defend it. It had been one of the most important decisions of her life, not because of what it had done for James, but because of what it had revealed about the kind of person she wanted to be. In standing up for someone else's dignity, she'd discovered her own. In recognizing his worth, she'd learned to measure her own success by different standards. And in defending a man the world had overlooked, she'd found exactly the partner she'd been searching for all her professional life.